Hey everybody, how's it going? Just bought a new HP laptop. It's got a webcam on it, so I wanted to go ahead and do a little test recording, if you will. Also wanted to take a chance though to talk about a subject that's overlooked quite a bit as far as guitar is concerned, and that's strings. You see a lot of videos here on YouTube that talk about, say, the differences between brands, differences in gauges, so on and so forth. And I feel like the information's pretty good, but I at least want to just give my own little personal spin on it, just kind of share some food for thought. Think there might be just some things that maybe I can potentially clear up or just ideas that I can impart on everybody just regarding the approach to string gauges and just, again, different brands in general. So I think the best place to start off is basically just maybe my history, if you will, of just my usage of guitar strings in general. So I started playing guitar in 2004, and I think I'd mentioned on a previous video where I'd originally started playing on my dad's guitars. He played in the 80s and then at some point put the instrument down to focus on other things. I do recall when I started playing in 2004, all of the strings that I was using were basically ones that he had bought in bulk years earlier. And just so happens that I have a pack from that brand anyway, not specifically those from the 80s, but GHS boomers, obviously a very familiar GHS, I should say, a very familiar brand to guitar aficionados out there, and the Boomer is obviously one of their most popular sets. So, as where this goes as far as string gauge, I remember the original gauges that I was using that my dad had originally bought was 9 to 42. Obviously, your extra light set. I think that's what GHS refers to it actually. Um, yes, they call it extra light. So those were the ones that I had used, and I'd always predominantly played in standard tuning. Actually, I think even if my memory serves me correct, I was trying to emulate stuff from Anthrax at the time, and I know that they had some songs in C sharp in a drop tuning, and me like not being familiar with drop tuning, I mistakenly tuned the whole guitar down to C sharp standard in 9 to 42, which made it work at the time, but in retrospect, just tension wise, just all wrong completely. That's a subject for another day, I think, just going into things like that. But I remember the gauge was 9 to 42, and that worked for a few years. And especially when I moved up to standard tuning, I think it was in 2006 or so, the gauge worked fine. And for the most part, liked it. I didn't have a problem with it. And I think when you're first starting out as a player at that time, you're not really as in tune just with the gauges in general, just how they feel compared to other sets. So I didn't really know the difference. And the GHS boomers, they always sounded really good. So there just wasn't any other thought. And I think also, if I remember correctly, my best friend who I started jamming with around that time in 2006, he also was using GHS boomers. And I believe that was because he was a huge fan of Zach Wild. And I think at the time, Zach had his own signature set with the company. So that was what I used for a number of years, 9 to 42. And I think it may have been, I don't know, like 2008, something like that. Maybe even a little bit before, but I remember just doing like some home recording and trying to do like my own cover of Annihilator's song "All for You," and it's a drop D song. A lot of chromatic movements and heavy palm muting on multiple strings. As far as just your main rhythm goes. And I remember just listening back to the recording that I had done and feeling like that the pitch was really high. And I knew that I had tuned up the guitar, to a digital tuner. I knew I was tuning it correctly as far as standard and then dropping, doing your drop D to, get the single power chord thing that you're doing or single finger power chord thing. I just remember feeling like the pitch though was just too high. Something felt a little bit off, and I remember just doing like some Google searching on this, just trying to understand, well, if I've tuned correctly, what's the issue? Of course, the subject of intonation comes up, but I knew it wasn't necessarily an intonation thing because I'm hitting on all of the low frets. I think it was fret 0 through 3. So I'm doing some research on it, and one of the things I found on a forum was that you could switch to a heavier gauge set of strings so that way you're not knocking yourself out of tune or driving notes sharp. And so the thought at that time then was to, basically research the gauges. And I know like GHS, what I referenced earlier with the looking up the extra light, they have a chart on the back, which you can reference for your different gauges and such and your different sizes. So I remember just looking, and the next one up that seemed to make sense at the time was custom light, 9 to 46. So that was the gauge I switched over to. And for songs like All for You and just again other drop D songs, staying in that standard 440 tuning, the gauge worked out fine as far as rhythm was concerned. And I think all the instruments I was playing on at that time were your 25 and a half inch scale length. So again, it made sense from that standpoint. I remember something changed though in 2009. I think I bought some fresh packs of GHS boomers, and I'm playing these new ones, and it just felt like they were dying a little bit faster. just wearing down a little bit quicker than I remembered. So the thought then came to me, it's like, well, maybe I should try some other strings. And I was really into Machine Head at the time and a couple other bands that they had started using Dunlop strings, and that's actually what I bought next was the Dunlop, their own custom light, if you will, 9 to 46, and this is actually the same packaging they used to have back in those days. I actually haven't bought a set of Dunlops in a while, so I don't really know if the packaging has changed per se on your 9 to 46. I know they're different on other ones, but these were the strings that I used basically from, I don't know, I think it was 2009 to 2014, and they worked out really well. I liked them. They felt a lot like GHS. Pretty much sounded very similar, and I thought the string life was a little bit longer, so it worked out really well. Fast forward to probably around 2015 or so, I started to experiment a little bit with different gauges, and I think at that point I acquired my first couple of instruments, or maybe my first of what was going to be a couple, I should say, of instruments that were 24 and 3/4 scale length. And I remember putting the 9 to 46 on it. It just didn't feel right. Just a little bit too floppy. It wasn't terrible by any stretch of the imagination, but at that point, you've been playing guitar for 11 years and pretty much know what you're looking for from a feel standpoint as far as your tension. So I just remember something felt a little bit off. And I remember watching a Josh Middleton video about string gauges, and he said maybe a lot of similar things as to what I'm saying here, just as far as what his approach was, making sure that he had enough tension to where everything just felt right to what he was used to. And then if he moved to like a lower gauge set of strings, like say nines, they just felt completely different for him, sometimes in a good way. So what I'm getting at is basically the thought was, okay, well, I'm going to try maybe a gauge up and see what happens on these 24 and 3/4 scale lengths. I had been using Dunlop heavy core strings, the 10 to 48 at that point, like for E flat tunings. So I tried them in standard tuning, I should say E440 standard on the 24 and 3/4 inch scale length guitars, and felt like the tension actually was very similar to the 9 to 46. So it was a winner. I liked it. The only issue was I started noticing at that time, and again, this was around 2015 or so, started noticing at that time that Dunlop strings that it was kind of the same thing as GHS. They just started feeling like they were dying a little bit faster, and maybe even fresh out of the package, not really as bright as you would have hoped. Because I think that's the thing. It's kind of one of the most underrated things. I think that when you feel like that the tone of your instrument isn't cutting it, instead of maybe going off and buying more guitars, like I've mistakenly done a couple times, and if you want to put it that way, just I've bought a whole bunch of them, and I got quite a few sitting around, and sometimes it really just comes down to if you don't think the tone is cutting it per se, maybe just try like a different gauge of strings, or even just put a new set on in general and just change them more often, because that brightness and that punchiness you get from new strings, I don't know, just to me when I first put on a new set of strings and start playing through, it's a really good feeling, and it's something that because I didn't used to change strings as often, it was a good feeling that I just didn't get enough of. Let's put it that way. So, anyways, where I'm going with that, the Dunlop strings just felt like they were kind of dying and just not quite as bright out of. They were dying faster, but not quite as bright out of the package. So then the next one to try, and I mentioned Josh Middleton a few minutes ago. Next one to try was the Dario strings, and these are the. This is not the gauge I tried back then. This is 10 and a half to 48, which was something else I experimented with. I'll get to that in a second. I tried their 10 to 4. Excuse me. I tried their. I bought their sets of 10 to 46. For whatever reason, I thought maybe that I'd try that on the 24 and 3/4 inch scale length guitars. But funny enough, I never actually tried them on that. I ended up buying them, and I didn't really touch them for the longest time. I'm not even really sure why. I think I just had a whole bunch of other Dunlops I had to get through. Sometimes I have this little OCD thing, I guess, where if I buy old strings and they're sitting around for a while unused, I feel like I have to go through them before I buy others. It's something that I've tried to get out of over time, so it prevents you from trying other string brands, just other brands in general. So when I bought the ESP LTD MH250 that I mentioned in one of my old videos, I remember that one the seller had highlighted that he had put the D'Addario EXL 10 to 46 on it before he shipped it out. So I was trying that gauge for the first time actually in standard tuning on a 25.5 inch scale length, and so obviously rhythm wise it felt exactly the same as what I was used to. Lead wise was a little bit heavier, a little bit more tension than I was used to, but I decided to stick with it and just kind of would see what happened. And I ended up actually like really liking it. I like I thought the little bit of the higher tension on the higher strings, if you will. I thought it was a little bit better maybe for open chord work, and then like for any clean work, just stuff like that. So then the idea was where this relates to string gauge was it's like, okay, I like the 10 to 46 on the 25.5 inch scale length. So how do I convert that, so to speak, on a 24 3/4 inch scale length? So then the idea was to try out these again, the D'Addario 10.5 to 48. So the 48 again, very, very familiar with how it felt. Again, like as far as the standard tuning on the 24 3/4 inch scale length. But I did not like the 10.5. I shouldn't say I didn't like it, just it felt like it was a little bit too much tension. So I stuck with that for a little while, just trying to see if I would like it, and it didn't quite work, unfortunately. So what I tried next was I switched to Ernie Ball, or I shouldn't say I switched. I decided I'd give Ernie Ball a try, and it was I bought some of these, the 10 to 46s, of course, just to kind of compare the strings, the Dario and Ernie Ball side by side. I also bought some of the Ernie Ball Ultra Slinky, the 10 to 48, and decided to go back to that because I was used to using the Dunlop Heavy Core 10 to 48. I figured I'd try the 10 to 48 again on the 24 3/4 inch scale length and just see how I felt with that versus the 10 to 46 on the 25.5 inches. Long story short, I actually, just going back to the 10 to the 48 on again, the 24 3/4, felt like it was like putting on an old glove that just fit perfectly. So I decided, okay, enough's enough. 10 to 46 for 25.5 inches, 10 to 48 for 24 3/4. So then the subject from there kind of comes up to, at least for me, comes up to just, I think, string tension in general. You can use tension calculators that are available on the internet and basically put in like your different size strings that you want to use basically for all six strings. And, basically your tension calculator is going to calculate out just how much tension is going to be on the neck as a whole. So I can't remember for sure, but I think it was the 10 to 46 again, for example. I'll call that your standard light set because I think that's basically what it is. You're a 25.5 inch scale length, 10 to 46. I want to say the tension was somewhere between 105 and 110 pounds. I don't remember the exact figure at the moment, but when you switch over a tension calculator to 24 3/4 inches and then put 10 to 48 and basically list out again all of the strings for each individual, again, just each of the individual six string slots. When you calculate out 10 to 48 in standard tuning on a 24 3/4 inch scale length, the tension actually, just again, the cumulative tension as a whole on the guitar neck is actually very similar. And that from a setup standpoint actually comes very much in handy because if you're trying to maintain the same amount of relief on the neck, you want to maintain just a similar feel as far as your action and such. To me, it's like you want to get all of your basically all of your factors as consistent as possible, or keep all of your variables as consistent as possible. I should say, just again from a tension standpoint, I think on the guitar neck as a whole. I think I'm not going to say it's impossible on these standardized sets to get exact tension from string to string in different tunings if you're using different gauges. But I have found for me personally that I think that give or take about 1 pound up or down as far as just a variance, if you will, for tension per string, I find that that seems to work the best. And that's actually where the D'Addario 10.5 to 48 come back into play. I said that I didn't really care for them as much on a standard tuning on the 24 3/4 inch scale length. However, if you try these bad boys out in E flat tuning and you're using 25.5 inch scale length, for your instrument, it actually turns out that tension wise, cumulatively, if you throw this in on a tension calculator, it comes out to, I think, within a ½ pound difference. It's extremely, extremely close. So again, you can be very consistent with your setup. And then just, I think from a string to string standpoint, just feeling your tension on your left hand as you're fretting notes, the feel is extremely similar. So I was actually very happy with these and decided I'd stick with them. Again, at least with this gauge anyway, I should say, for E flat tuning. And then I don't have a pack next to me right now, but just for D standard tuning, as far as your, again, just your maintaining the same tension as closely as possible to the 10 to 46 and then to the 10.5 to 48 in E flat tuning, I found that for D standard, 11 to 52 pretty much did the job there. Maybe a little bit thicker on the low E string, when you have it tuned down to D. It maybe feels a little bit different, but for the most part, not way too radically different. So again, keeps everything pretty consistent. Where all this goes, so I've mentioned now basically what my approach is to different gauges. Where this goes from here basically is what are my experiences with the different string brands just as a whole. So I mentioned earlier GHS, liked them initially, felt like they were kind of losing their luster with the new packages around 2008. Just felt like they died a little bit too quickly, so I moved on. Dunlop, same idea, loved them initially, and then over time felt like they weren't as bright out of the package, felt like they died a little bit too quick. So then D'Addario basically it became my favorite, just kind of as a whole. Just feeling like, combination of good brightness out of the package, good punchiness, felt like they lasted a little bit longer. So I liked them. Then the idea was, well, there's been a couple others that I haven't tried yet. And it was actually about a month ago, right now, around July 4th, that a musician's friend was running a pretty big sale on 3 packs of Ernie Ball string. So that's where they come back into play. I decided to, try out the regular Slinky for the, 10 to 46 for your regular E standard, 25.5 inch scale length. Bought the Ultra Slinkies for the Les Paul scale length. Actually ended up trying it, or ended up buying several different gauges just for things to try out. Just I felt if I was going to take this dive, I might as well just go into it as deeply as possible and just see what ends up happening. So I've been playing on the Ernie Ball strings for a few weeks now. I got a couple guitars stringed up with these, or strung up with these, and then a couple of them strung up with the with D'Addario. And the results have actually been quite interesting. So this is kind of the point of what I really wanted to share with this. I still think D'Addario as a whole, just at least from what I'm seeing, they seem to retain the brightness a little bit more out of the package and last a little bit longer. But interestingly, I find that Ernie Ball to me just feels, from a feel standpoint, I should say first, the way that they feel, hence the name Slinky, they feel just a little bit lighter, maybe not quite as stiff, although stiffness isn't a huge problem when you have when you've done the math as far as the gauges of what you're used to. They feel like they're a little bit looser in feel as a whole when they're strung up and up to tension, but not to a point where, the tension is so low, obviously, to where you're losing any of that tonal characteristic. I find that the Ernie balls to me they sound a little bit more juicier, for lack of a better term, right out of the package. So I really really like the sound of them. I feel like they corrode a little bit faster though than D'Addario, and that's not necessarily a knock against Ernie Ball because here's another factor that I think isn't mentioned on videos as much. A lot of us when we're playing and we're sweating and the sweat's coming off our fingertips, a lot of us have different levels of acidic content in our hands and just in our body. And sounds really weird, but it's something that you can't ignore. Body chemistry is a real thing. So what I think for me is seeing other people talk about with Ernie Ball strings that they seem to last really long, and these same people will say, well, D'Addario or GHS or whatever, they die faster. So I think that's an important point to consider. The acidic content of your hands, I don't think it's ever going to be completely the same for two people. So what may not work for you as well for a certain string brand, may work completely differently for somebody else. So I think it's worth trying all the different strings. So much so that what I've done, I mentioned earlier when I first, held up the GHS pack, ended up buying a bunch of GHS strings recently, so I'm going to be giving them a shot. Decided to go all out with this little experiment, and our friends SIT Strings from Akron, Ohio. Actually met the guys at NAMM a couple years ago, and really cool guys. I think definitely worth checking out their strings just as a whole, just how friendly they are and how personable they are at their booth. But I played a pack of SITs a couple years ago and really liked them. I thought they were great out of the package. Felt like they held their tone relatively for a relatively long time and kept that brightness. So I'm curious now, roughly 4 or 5 years later, trying these out again. I'm curious to see basically are my impressions of them going to be the same as they were back then. And very curious to see if GHS will feel the same for me. And just again, maybe with these changes in, or I shouldn't say changes, but with these differences in, acid content in the sweat from our fingers, maybe for example, things have changed for me for GHS. Just off the top of my head, I remember when I was playing these things back in the day in 2008. I was actually a lot heavier than I am now. Basically was overweight, probably, I don't know, 70 pounds heavier or something like that. And I could see where from the worst foods that I was eating back then was probably generating a much different kind of sweat out of the fingertips that maybe caused these strings to die out a lot faster than the ones that I was playing that had been manufactured, say, in the late 80s or the early 90s. The ones that I mentioned earlier that my dad had bought in bulk and had held on to for all the years. So again, just where I'm going with that is, just to sum it up, the acidic content of your fingers, I think it's gonna from the sweat in your fingers is gonna heavily determine, what strings may last long or not last very long at all for you. It's gonna determine how fast that they're gonna die out and lose their brightness. A lot of different factors there to consider. So I just think that that's something very important to think about. One last thing that I'll share also, just with, and this is D'Addario strings specifically that I'm talking about. Not to make fun of them or put them down in any way because I love their strings. I think they're a great company. With these experiments I'm running right now, I have one of the packs of the 10.5 to 48. I took one of the packs and strung up one of my guitars, the Scotty and Silverburst I mentioned 2 videos ago. I have it set up in E flat tuning right now with the 10.5 to 48 gauge strings. And actually was just playing on it last night, and I think I've been using the same set for about 3 weeks or so. And just rotating what guitar I'm playing, different nights of the week, and just basically to see like these different brands that I'm using so far, Ernie Ball and D'Addario, just seeing basically which ones are dying faster. And here's one of the more interesting things I'm noticing. The D'Addario 10 to 46, for whatever reason, seem to die out a bit faster than the 10.5 to 48. And these strings I've all bought, basically, I would assume manufactured, at the same times. It's not like that I am using one set that was manufactured 5 years ago and another one that I just bought a month ago, that may have been manufactured in the last 6 months or something like that. So that's another important thing to consider, I think. Differences in your alloys, if you will, or just your metals. I know these strings are all nickel wound. That's another factor that I forgot to mention earlier. These are all like your nickel wound construction. So I think like your differences in your metals and such like that, you have to think about it that there's probably like I guess I'm going to call it a tolerance, or I'll use the word variance again. There's differences I think in the components that are being used for the manufacturing process to where I think there's a relatively good level of consistency, but I'm starting to realize now that consistency from pack to pack, there maybe is a little bit more variance than we think about there. So that's something you have to consider as well. Where I'm going with that is if you're wanting to shoot out different string brands or whatever, maybe sometimes it might be worth using multiple packs. Again, I'm having good experiences with the Ernie Ball strings right now, despite them dying a little bit faster or corroding. I feel like the tone is holding relatively well at this point, and the D'Addarios are performing about the same as normal. Just again, that interesting thing with the 10 to 46 that are kind of just seeing them dying a bit faster than 10.5 to 48. Anyways, I've been rambling on a little bit too long here. At some point, I'll make another video probably sharing my thoughts about GHS and SIT strings. Just wanted to share this one with you really quick. And again, just wanted to test the new webcam microphone that I got with this HP laptop. But maybe the one final takeaway that I guess I'll share on this video is that, I think a lot of us, I'm going to say mistakenly, sometimes we have these brand preferences, and maybe mistakenly isn't even the right word. I think we're justified sometimes in having brand preferences, but I think something like guitar strings can vary a little bit. So I think it's worth trying out different brands. And at the end of the day, if you're having good experiences, I think with multiple brands, why not use multiple? Especially maybe if you find like sales, for example, where maybe Ernie Ball might be a little bit cheaper than your preferred D'Addario, or if you're a GHS user and you're finding they're a little bit more expensive than D'Addario is, for example, maybe it's worth trying out different, brands just to get again, just a different feel for what's out there. You might stumble onto something that works better for you, maybe even find something that works better for a specific guitar. So again, just kind of some random thoughts there, but I'll go ahead and wrap this up. I appreciate you taking the time out to watch. Hope everybody's having a good and safe 2021 so far. I think I mentioned that in my last video that I wished that everybody was doing well. We're in the month of August, so it's pretty crazy how fast the year is going on. So, we'll see if I get another one out before the end of 2021, maybe talking about more strings, or who knows, maybe I'll actually play the guitar again at some point on a video. So anyways, hope everybody takes care. Have a great rest of your day.